I call the member for Bowman.
Deputy Speaker, the Federal Government and Medicines Australia have signed a Memorandum of Understanding in May 2010, and details of these were released in the budget this year. The memorandum intends to deliver savings to the government of around $1.9 billion over the next 5 years. Now, the merits of the PBS, of course, are well known to both sides of this chamber. It's been providing access to clinically proven cost-effective medicines for over half a century. And the PBS and the process for listing drugs is well known, and it enjoys bipartisan support. Of course, we know that prior to listing, pharmaceuticals need to go through the most rigorous of evaluation, both for safety and efficacy, but also for cost effectivity, to ensure that the taxpayer's dollar is well spent in ensuring that Australia has one of the finest health systems in the world. Now, the changes that are being debated today and in this bill and part of the MOU look at statutory price reductions, price disclosure and under co-payment data, the last of which has not been always easily available. Now, many of them are largely technical amendments, and they relate to matters such as PBS pricing and how we actually calculate price reductions as a result of statutory price reductions, policies that we first saw implemented by the Howard government in their last term in 2006. We also know that there are amendments that will streamline the way that drugs are listed for supply under Section 100 amendments. Now, of course, a key challenge for successive governments is to ensure that there is enough investment in new pharmaceuticals, while at the same time making sure that as drugs flow through their patented period and into off-patent periods, that generic drugs fall in price satisfactorily so that we are in turn able to use taxpayers' dollars effectively. One great challenge for Australia has been that by having a PBS that offers very equitable access to pharmaceuticals nationwide within 24 hours and at an affordable price, particularly for those who are concessionaires, is that in many cases we've had an upwardly sticky system where generic prices fail to fall after the patent period is completed. And no better are there examples than comparisons with neighbouring economies, New Zealand and the UK. And I note the work of Philip Clark, but also other writings over the last 5 years, looking particularly at the statin class of drugs, one of the most commonly taken pharmaceuticals in the country. And what we know there is that while Australia continues to pay upwards of $30 a month for a 40 milligram dose of a very common statin drug, simvastatin, we see that in New Zealand and the UK these have fallen to around $3 or even $1.50. And even in the US, we saw the Walmart intervention where some of the most common categories of generic drugs were available for in the vicinity of $1 to $2 per month. Yet we still continue to pay upwards of 10 to 20 times that amount here in Australia for exactly the same pharmaceutical, exactly the same preparation and product. And that is a cause for concern because the PBS is expanding. Despite the impressive policy reforms introduced under the Howard government that has reduced that growth, we've seen that after reductions, too often those reductions again escape. We lose control of that increase in price growth, and it is becoming less and less clear exactly how that money is being invested. Now, what we know is that when we take New Zealand's approach straight across the Tasman Sea, they've taken much stronger action to see generic prices fall. And their approach was, in fact, to put out to tender the supply of generic drugs and let the generic providers actually engage in a market-based competition to provide national supply. They saw prices fall up to 93%, an extraordinary result. Move to the Netherlands, where generic drugs such as statins cost around 1/20th of what they do right here in Australia. These are drugs that are so common that more often than not senior Australians are actually taking these pharmaceuticals on a regular basis, and the costs to our health system are enormous. And the government, on top of this, as part of this legislation we're debating today, have actually conceded the ground in reform of pharmaceuticals and the PBS. They've ceded the ground and said for the next 4 years there will be no more cost negotiations or further reforms, which I think is a cause for significant concern, because this part of the health system is one that I think needs more scrutiny than to walk away for 4 years and say that there will be no more efforts to tune this system and make it work even better for Australians. Now, the pharmaceutical agreements that were introduced by the former government in 2007 introduced the issue of regulatory price cuts, where effectively when the first new generic product arrives in the market, there is a mandated cut right across the sector. And that 12.5% policy yielded significant financial dividends, and I understand that under this legislation that will increase to 16. But what we know from research is that even with these mandated drops in prices, doctors themselves can continue to make choices about whether they wish to prescribe a generic drug when it hits the market. Many countries have set guidelines, and the UK is one, that when there is a cheaper, usually generic product that comes onto the market, there have to be significant and clear clinical reasons why clinicians don't go right ahead and prescribe the cheaper product. In Australia, it's so often not the case, and the whole front-ending of pharmaceutical companies that can produce a slightly more improved, for instance, statin, becomes the effort to convince GPs that they need to go for the extra 1 or 2% clinical efficacy, even if it costs the National Health System and the PBS significantly more than that. The lessons there is that in the UK they've gained considerable ability to shift people onto generic pharmaceuticals, where in Australia so often we tend to evergreen the process, keeping Australian equivalent patients on the patented product, which is significantly more expensive. And of course the recent PBS agreement gives Australian pharmaceutical companies business certainty, and that would be agreed on both sides of the House. What we want is business certainty for the innovators so that they are more confident to invest in the expensive multi-clinical trials that are so important to bringing new drugs through the pipeline, but they also need the certainty to know that when they do business in Australia, there is a PBS that can afford the best pharmaceuticals that money and Western science can provide. The great concern is that where upwards of 1/3 of the entire PBS bill is spent on generic pharmaceuticals, when in the rest of the world that can be as little as 10%, we are foregoing the opportunity to bring these drugs on quickly, and that is what I think is a great detraction of the current PBS system, is the time it takes to bring these pharmaceuticals on. So it's great to see that in the MOU there's an undertaking from government that after the recommendation of the PBAC, within a 6-month period, Cabinet will consider and make a decision on whether to list the drug. And it would be hoped that it will be a lot faster than even 6 months. That is a lifetime for someone waiting for a brand new medication. So in some ways we'd like to see an even faster streamlined system, and so often when you legislate for a minimum, the minimum becomes the maximum, and everything drags out to 5 months and 29 days. We want to see these drugs coming on straight away. What we can't afford is a government that doesn't have the courage to really look at the best possible system for pricing of generic pharmaceuticals, freeing up the resources and moving that round to the front end to help the innovators. Now, you have all the members of Medicines Australia confident in that MOU, but there's one thing that I know. As soon as we can get generics priced somewhere where they are priced in the rest of the developed world, it will be an even better place for Australian patients who are waiting desperately for those new medications. That's the challenge that we face at the moment, and on any normative international comparison, Australia does perform poorly in the pricing of generic pharmaceuticals. And the great paradox is it's our wonderful PBS that does it. The fact that we pay generously for either concessionaire or non-concessionaire co-payments for pharmaceuticals, it actually removes that incentive to be any cheaper. I mean, why would one price a pharmaceutical any cheaper than the $28 or $29 one will receive from the government? Why would you do it if you're guaranteed of that amount? The PBS and its very generosity actually makes it difficult to move and garner those really great savings that are possible in the generic sector. So let's make no mistake, the front-ending and bringing great new drugs through the pipeline is a very, very risky and expensive process. And we need a government system that makes it as certain as possible for these companies that if they can bring through a life-saving drug or a significant advancement on what's currently available, that should be supported and it should be encouraged. But in the same token, what we can't afford to do is to do as this government has done, and that is to walk away effectively from any future reforms for at least 4 years. I mean, it's a very confident decision that you'll even be around as a government, Deputy Speaker, in 4 years' time. But that's right. What we've done in this MOU is forfeit the right to have that conversation. That's an awfully large price to pay, and particularly if, as can happen, very, very expensive pharmaceuticals can come down the pipeline in a relatively short period of time, 18 months to 2 years. And I think it was a little short-sighted of the government to do that. Now, let's remember what happened in 2007. The coalition was faced with similar challenges around the PBS, and their suite of measures have already got demonstrated outcomes. This was the separation of single-brand and multiple-brand medicines into the F1 and the F2 formularies, the statutory price reductions for multiple-brand medicines, of which I've referred to before, the 12.5% price reduction when that first bioequivalent drug for a single-brand medicine is introduced, or where a medicine obviously moves from F1 to F2, and the price disclosure arrangements, which this legislation will be extending to 1,600 different lines, which I acknowledge will create for the government a significant challenge through all of the legal challenges to be able to actually identify what is going on with those pricings and with that disclosure. It's a significant challenge, but it's an important one to progress if we are to understand whether pharmaceuticals are being priced at the market or at the most competitive price possible. We have the incentive payment in 2007 for community pharmacies to process claims using PBS online, and of course the community service obligation for pharmaceutical wholesalers who meet specific service obligation. And let's look at those PBS reform impacts they've been reported into, and that showed that over the forecasted 10-year period from 2008 to 9, that patients would potentially pay less, between $592 million and $803 million. And that's a significant saving for patients through their co-payments, because a large number of pharmaceuticals actually become cheaper than the co-payment itself. That's extremely relevant, particularly for the 30 to 35% of Australians who aren't concessionaires and pay what we deem to be the higher co-payment, and that can really mount up prior to the safety net, the pharmaceutical safety net, for families that have to pay that full amount. They are the prime beneficiaries of these kinds of reform. And of course the total savings to government from the reforms are even higher, because they're saving on having to pay a full co-payment for every one of these prescriptions, between 3.6 and 5.8 million. And I do draw the House's attention to research done by Philip Clark from the University of Sydney, who had done reports on what savings could have been achieved, and this was published in the Medical Journal of Australia with his colleague Ed Fitzgerald. Estimates there that Australia could have saved $1 billion in the past 4 years if the UK prices had simply been achieved in Australia, and that, more importantly, were we to implement the English pricing systems in Australia, savings could be in excess of $3 billion over the next 10 years. And I can see the Shadow Finance Minister licking his lips as he thinks about what could be done in the health system with $3 billion invested in the new drugs coming through the pipeline, being brought on early. And that is a genuine incentive for our pharmaceutical manufacturers and for our innovators to be coming up with the new breakthroughs. The Gardasols, the treatments that save thousands of lives and reduce morbidity. They are the areas we should be investing in, not paying unnecessarily high prices for generic pharmaceuticals, which are being produced around the world in large factories for sometimes less than a fraction of a cent per dose. Now, the PBS reforms that were initiated by the Coalition were significantly successful, and we note that this MOU has the support of Medicines Australia and another number of other submissions as well. They are encouraging both sides of the chamber to consider this legislation, and I just make those following observations about the ground that has been forfeited in basically declining to look at this area again for any form of reform for the next 4 years. It is terribly important, therefore, that the Parliament does carefully scrutinise all of the measures in this bill. The measures for under-co-payment data, statutory price reductions, which are being increased to 16%, and also, most importantly, and probably most challenging of all, price disclosure. The great challenge for government is there simply isn't enough information about the price that wholesalers provide pharmaceuticals to pharmacists. And we know that there are significant discounts. And look, if those discounts lead to better service or better provision of pharmaceuticals or a better range of products to patients, one wouldn't complain about it. But fundamentally, that discounting is government and taxpayer resources that need to be used well. And that's why I would believe that this side of the chamber would want to see a full and frank evaluation of the impacts of this legislation, where it's going, and we're also mindful that it's currently under an inquiry at the moment, and I think it would be very, very short-sighted to move forward and to vote on this bill prior to seeing the results of that Senate inquiry into this very bill. So this bill will be expanding those elements that I've referred to before. It will be extending on some of the things that were achieved in 2007, but I would certainly not want to see this bill be completely debated and pass through this chamber without fully seeing the results of the Senate inquiry which are being conducted at the moment. We have a date which we expect that inquiry to come down. I hope that we would put off this debate until that inquiry has been heard and read.